My father laughed into his wine glass and said it like it was nothing. "She's just an enlisted grunt, don't expect much." The room answered with polite chuckles, the kind people use when they don't want to challenge a man who's used to being agreed with. Then my father's friend's son, fresh haircut, Newbar's confidence still creased from the tailor, smiled, cleared his throat and said, "That's funny. Last week she was the one who approved my promotion." Forks paused mid-air. Someone's chair scraped. Every head turned toward me at once, as if the table had learned my name before my father ever did. Thanksgiving has a way of pretending it's gentle while sharpening its edges. The house smelled like turkey skin, and butter sage, and old wood warmed by too many stories. Football murmured from the den, the announcer's voice rising and falling like a tide no one was really watching. The table was long and borrowed, folding legs braced by books dressed in a tablecloth that had been ironed with more care than anyone admitted. Place cards leaned against water glasses, names written in a careful hand that suggested order could be coaxed into family if you tried hard enough. My father sat at the head. He always did, even when the chair was technically neutral. He had a way of occupying space that didn't ask permission. Shoulders square back, straight, voice measured to carry without shouting. Years of command had trained the air to listen to him. He wore a blazer over a collared shirt, the uniform of a man who believed rank should translate everywhere. When he spoke, Forks slowed. When he paused, people leaned in as if silence were an instruction. I sat halfway down the table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked until needed. I'd learned that geometry early. My plate steamed. I hadn't taken a bite yet. The gravy boat glistened under the lights like it wanted to be useful. My hands rested on my lap palms, flat against my thighs, a posture that reads calm when you've practiced it long enough. I counted breaths the way I do before meetings that matter. Dad was in one of his stories, small-town politics, weather patterns, the price of things that used to be cheaper. People nodded. My aunt smiled and refilled water glasses. The friend from church laughed too loud at the right moments. Then my father gestured with his fork toward the young man beside him, a gesture that said both introduction and ownership. "This is Mark's boy," he said. "Commissioned, good head on his shoulders." Pride rounded his vowels. "Future's bright." The young man smiled the way people do when they're proud and trying not to show it. "Sir," he said, nodding to my father. He glanced down the table, polite, unassuming, still learning how to inhabit his uniform when he wasn't wearing it. "And my daughter," my father added almost as an aside, waving his fork in my direction without looking. "She enlisted. Works hard, I'm sure." He chuckled, the sound practiced. "But let's be honest, she's just an enlisted grunt, don't expect much." The laugh landed like a plate set down too hard. It clinked. It spread. A few people smiled out of reflex. Someone cleared their throat. I felt heat rise into my face and stop there, contained by habit. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, on a faint stain shaped like a state I couldn't quite name. I knew this script. I knew the beats. If I stayed still, it would pass. It didn't. Mark's boy, his name was Ethan, I would learn later because names have a way of arriving when you finally need them, tilted his head just slightly. The smile didn't leave his face, but it changed its job. It became careful. He set his fork down. He looked at me, really looked, and something like recognition flickered and then steadied. "That's funny," he said, and his voice wasn't loud, just placed. "Last week she was the one who approved my promotion." Silence did what silence does when it's asked to work. It gathered weight. Chairs stopped complaining. The television seemed to recede as if the house itself were embarrassed to interrupt. I felt the table's attention shift the way a compass needle snaps when it finds north. Eyes moved, questions formed without mouths opening. My father laughed again, a shorter sound this time. "Approved," he said. "You mean processed paperwork?" Ethan shook his head once. "Sir, with respect," he said, and there it was, the phrase that both softens and sharpens. "She chairs the review. If she doesn't sign, it doesn't move." A few people inhaled at once. I caught my mother's cousin watching me with an expression I hadn't earned in this room before. The gravy boat trembled as someone set it down. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I've learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let the truth finish its sentence without you. My father turned toward me, then really turned, and for the first time that evening he looked surprised. Not angry, not disappointed. Surprised as if a map had added a road overnight. "Is that so?" he asked, smiling in a way that invited agreement. I met his eyes. I kept my voice level. "I serve where I'm assigned," I said. It wasn't a dodge, it was accurate. Accuracy has always been my refuge. Someone laughed softly, unsure. Plates shifted. The room began to breathe again, but differently now, like lungs learning a new rhythm. My father nodded, filed the moment away, and moved on to a safer subject. The turkey was carved, potatoes were passed, people ate. But the table had changed. You could feel it in the way questions cued themselves, in the way Ethan watched me with something like relief, in the way my father's stories lost their edges and grew cautious. Before that night, before the table, before the glance, before the approval that mattered only because it had been denied me in a different room for so long, there was a house where rank came before love, where discipline arrived early and stayed late, where silence was both a tool and a verdict. To understand how a Thanksgiving sentence could tilt a room, you have to know the weight it was set against. Because the truth is, my father didn't always underestimate me. He simply learned to do it early and practiced until it felt like principle. The house I grew up in had rules the way other houses had furniture. You could feel them before you could name them, the way you feel cold before you see your breath. Shoes lined at a precise angle by the door. Keys hung on the same hook every night. Voices lowered when my father entered a room, not because he demanded it, but because his presence carried an expectation that learned how to stand on its own. My earliest memory of him isn't a hug. It's a correction. I was 7, maybe 8, standing in the kitchen on linoleum worn thin near the sink. He placed his hands on my shoulders and squared them. "Stand up straight," he said, not unkindly, just final. Posture tells the world what you're made of. The clock over the stove ticked. The smell of black coffee and shoe polish braided itself into the morning. I learned then that love in our house arrived disguised as instruction. My father had served. Not long enough to be softened by distance, not short enough to forget the taste of command. He carried that service into civilian life like a second spine. At the grocery store, people called him Sir. At church, he chaired committees. At home, he kept ledgers, actual ones, hardbound and neat. Expenses, chores, schedules. If you did something right, it went unremarked. If you did it wrong, it was noted in silence. Silence was his most effective tool. It didn't shout. It waited. My mother moved differently. She kept books by the bed and poems in the margins of grocery lists. She believed kindness could be taught the way math is taught, patiently with examples. When my father inspected my room on Saturdays, bed corners, tight shoes aligned, she stood in the doorway and watched like weather, ready to intervene only if the storm threatened damage. Mostly she trusted time. In our house, rank had a shape. It was masculine. It was inherited. My father believed legacies traveled through sons. He didn't say it outright at first. He didn't have to. It lived in the stories he told, the way he praised other men's boys, the way his eyes slid past me when conversations turned to futures. When I was small, I tried to earn my way into that narrative. I ran faster. I spoke less. I memorized rules like hymns. At 12, I told him I wanted to join ROTC at school. He looked at me over the newspaper, eyebrows lifting just enough to register surprise. Why, he asked. "I like the structure," I said. That was true. I like knowing where I stand. He folded the paper carefully, set it down, and considered me like a problem he didn't feel obligated to solve. "That's not for you," he said. Not cruelly, definitively. "You'll find something else." "What if I don't want something else?" I asked. He smiled then, a small controlled thing. "Everyone wants something they're not built for," he said. "Discipline is learning the difference." The house got quiet after that. Dinner at 6, news at 7, lights out at 10. The rules didn't change. The space between us did. When I brought home good grades, he nodded once. When I won a track meet, he suggested I work on my form. Praise in his economy was inefficient. My mother did her persuasion in the margins. She drove me to sign-ups and parked 2 blocks away so the car wouldn't be seen from Main Street. She asked questions that let me hear my own answers. "What do you want most?" she asked once, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. "A fair measure," I said. It surprised us both. High school sharpened everything. My father attended my events when they aligned with his sense of propriety. He skipped the ones that didn't. On nights when I stayed up late studying, he passed the kitchen and said nothing. Silence again doing its work. When I told him I wanted to enlist, he laughed. It wasn't loud. It was dismissive, a sound you use to close a door without slamming it. "You're chasing attention," he said, "not service." "I want both," I said, because I hadn't learned yet when to save my breath. He stood and straightened the stack of mail on the counter, aligning the edges. "You don't have the Constitution," he said. He didn't mean stamina, he meant my sex. I mailed my paperwork without telling him. The acceptance came in a thin envelope first, then a thicker one later. I hid them in a book my mother loved and pretended not to notice how my hands shook when I touched the paper. When I finally told him, he listened, nodded once and said, "We'll discuss it later." We didn't. Graduation night, he didn't come to the backyard party. The lights my mother strung glowed anyway. Friends asked if I was scared. Yes, I said, and no. A familiar sedan rolled past and kept going. It felt like being saluted and dismissed at the same time. The morning I left, my mother hugged me hard and then stepped back to look. "Stand up straight," she said, smiling through it. My father had an appointment to get the tires rotated. On the bus, I watched the town slide by, the diner, the hardware store, the flag too big for its pole, and pressed my forehead to the glass. I wasn't running from him. I was running toward a measure that didn't require his permission. What I didn't know then was how much of him I carried with me. His insistence on order, his respect for systems, his belief that details matter. He taught me those things without meaning, to the way weather teaches trees to bend. He just never imagined I'd use them somewhere he couldn't see. By the time Thanksgiving came years later, the house had changed owners, but the rules still lived in my bones. I knew how to sit, how to wait, how to let a man finish a sentence even when it misnamed me. What I hadn't learned yet was how a room could relearn me all at once and how much that would cost him. Basic training stripped names down to syllables and days down to tasks. Hair on the floor, boots aligned under racks, voices counted instead of heard. I learned quickly that the trick wasn't to be louder, it was to be exact. Exact with time, exact with numbers, exact with people. Precision is a kind of kindness when everything else is noise. I wasn't exceptional in the ways movies like. I didn't break records or give speeches that made instructors pause. I showed up early. I took notes that other people borrowed and forgot to return. I learned who needed an extra reminder and who needed space. I learned the difference between a mistake that teaches and one that gets someone hurt. When you're new, you watch. When you're smart, you keep watching after you're allowed to stop. After training assignments came the way weather does, inevitable, impersonal. I landed in roles that required attention more than applause, reviews, evaluations, schedules that braided people's lives together and then asked them to hold. I learned to read handwriting and hesitation, to notice when a form was filled out too perfectly, when a recommendation used too many adjectives. I learned that confidence can be loud, and competence often whispers. The ledger started as a habit. Not an actual book, not yet, but a mental accounting I kept because someone had to, who showed up when it was inconvenient, who asked the right questions, who covered for others, and who cut corners when they thought no one was looking. I didn't tally to punish. I tallied to protect. Promotions aren't prizes. They're responsibilities that change the air in a room. You put the wrong person in the wrong place, and the whole structure leans. There were meetings where voices climbed and hands waved, and I sat at the end of the table with a pen and a stack of files. I listened for patterns, not claims. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. This one is ready, this one isn't. I learned to offer reasons that didn't invite argument. Data, observation, history. The truth presented like furniture, solid, useful, not decorative. Some people resented it. Some tried to charm me. Some mistook my quiet for softness. I let them. Quiet can be a kind of camouflage. When you don't advertise, you get a clearer view of what's real. The first time a decision I made changed someone's life, in a way I could see it wasn't dramatic. It was a man who'd been overlooked twice already, solid and unshowy, who shook my hand after the notice came through. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, and his voice did a thing voices do when relief finally arrives. I nodded. I went back to my desk. The day kept moving. As the years stacked, so did the files. My name began to circulate in a specific way, not as a headline but as a checkpoint. If it passed me, it moved. If it didn't, it waited. I didn't seek that reputation. I understood its weight. Authority that isn't loud has to be fair, or it collapses under its own silence. There were nights I took work home in my head, replaying choices the way you replay routes on a map. Did I miss something? Did I mistake polish for readiness? I learned to sit with doubt without letting it drive. Doubt used properly sharpens judgment. Used improperly, it paralyzes. My father taught me that discipline meant control. The service taught me that control includes knowing when to ask another set of eyes. I started keeping an actual ledger then, not official, my own. A small notebook with a black cover, edges already wearing soft. Dates, initials, notes in a shorthand only I needed. Not secrets, reminders. Who asked for help? Who offered it? Who grew when pressure arrived? It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. When decisions pile up, memory lies. Paper doesn't. People noticed the notebook and joked about it. What's in there, they'd ask. Receipts, I'd say, and smile just enough to let the joke land. The work never came with ceremonies. You don't get applause for preventing disasters that never happen. You get a smoother day, fewer calls at night. A sense sometimes that the room breathes easier. That's the currency. That and the trust that builds when people realize you're not keeping score to win, you're keeping it so everyone gets home. I didn't talk to my father about any of it. Not because I was hiding, because there was nothing to explain. He hadn't asked about my days since the day I left. Our conversations when they happened were about weather and maintenance and whether I'd changed the oil. We shared facts that didn't invite intimacy. It was a truce, and I honored it. Thanksgiving invitations came and went. I showed up when I could, stayed polite, kept my answers short. Work's fine, busy, same. My father filled the space with stories that didn't include me. I let him. The ledger didn't need witnesses. The irony is that much of what I did would have made sense to him if he'd seen it. Systems, accountability, fair measures. He'd taught me to value those things before he decided they weren't mine to use. But understanding doesn't require recognition. It requires repetition. And I had work to do. By the time Ethan's file crossed my desk, it was unremarkable in the best way. Solid evaluations, consistent growth, a few notes about mentorship, one flagged concern that had been addressed without defensiveness. I read it twice, not because it needed it, but because that's my habit. I signed. The pen didn't hesitate. I didn't know his last name then. I didn't know where he'd sit at a table months later or who would try to diminish me for sport. I only knew the ledger was clean. That's how the quiet work moves forward without prediction, carrying consequences you don't get to choose. When I set the notebook back in my bag that day, I tapped the cover once, a private punctuation. The kind that says this holds. And because it held a room would one day learn my name without me saying it. Names change when they're spoken under pressure. Titles do too. In calm rooms, people say them the way they're printed, flat, ornamental, useful for introductions. In rooms where something might break, names become tools, shortened, weighted, chosen because they work. I learned that shift without anyone explaining it. It showed up in the way conversations paused when I entered, not because I demanded space, but because the work needed room. It showed up in emails that grew concise when my address was added, in meetings where arguments cooled once the facts were laid out and the room realized I'd brought the receipts. It showed up in the way junior officers stopped trying to impress me and started trying to be clear. Somewhere along the line, people stopped asking what I thought and started asking when I'd be available. That's the moment you know you're trusted, not when you're praised, but when your calendar becomes the hinge. The nickname arrived sideways. It always does. Someone said it once, half joking, half testing the air. Another repeated it with less humor. A third used it without knowing it was a nickname at all. I didn't claim it. I didn't correct it. I let it find its own shape. They called me the Ledger. Not to my face at first. In side comments. In the way people would say, if it passes her ledger, you're good, as if the notebook had grown hands and judgment. It wasn't about me. It was about what I represented: consistency, memory, consequence. In a system where people rotate in and out, where time erases context faster than it should, someone keeping track becomes a kind of anchor. I wasn't flattered. I was careful. Names can make people lazy. I doubled down on process. I asked for second opinions. I documented everything. I learned to explain decisions in ways that could be defended months later by someone who wasn't me. If you're going to be the ledger, you don't get to scribble. There was a decision that tested that discipline more than the others. A candidate with connections, good ones. Letters from people whose voices carried weight. A record that looked strong until you read the margins. Patterns of deflection. Credit claimed too quickly. Responsibility shed too easily. The kind of person who performs well when watched and cuts corners when the lights dim. The room leaned toward approval. It always does when the path is smooth. I asked a question that slowed it down. Then another. I didn't accuse. I clarified. Silence gathered. Not the punishing kind, the thinking kind. "We'll wait," I said finally. 6 months. Let's see what the pattern does when no one's pointing at it. There were sighs. There was pushback. Someone said I was being overly cautious. I wrote it down. 6 months later, the pattern repeated. Louder this time. The decision stood. The ledger held. That's the thing about quiet authority. It doesn't need to be defended if it's built correctly. It waits. When Ethan's name came back across my desk later, this time for promotion, the contrast was clean. The work spoke. The people around him spoke without embellishment. The one concern raised came with an account of how he'd addressed it. I signed again. No flourish, just ink where it belonged. I didn't expect gratitude. I rarely do. What I didn't expect was recognition carried into a room I'd spent a lifetime shrinking inside. After Thanksgiving, messages came in. Not congratulations, those are uncomfortable. Clarifications, questions. People checking their understanding of who I was and how I worked. I answered as I always do, plainly. I didn't recount the table. I didn't explain my father. Work doesn't need backstory to be valid. My father didn't call. He didn't need to. Silence was familiar ground. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the way our mutual acquaintances addressed me now, in the way stories about me came back, slightly altered, less dismissive, more careful. The town had learned a new name for me, and it wasn't the one my father had been using. I thought about that on a long drive back to base, the road unspooling under headlights, the radio low. How names get chosen, how they stick. My father had named me early what I was allowed to be, what I wasn't. The service hadn't renamed me. It had simply used me until the use became undeniable. There's a danger in becoming an idea. People start to talk around you instead of to you. I guarded against that. I kept my door open. I kept my language simple. I made a point of crediting teams, of stepping back when the moment wasn't mine. The ledger isn't the story. It's the proof. Weeks later, in a meeting that had nothing to do with Thanksgiving and everything to do with planning, someone new hesitated before speaking. "I ran this past the ledger," he said, catching himself flushing. "I mean through review." I smiled and shook my head. "Names are lighter than work," I said. "Show me what you've got." He did. It held. At night, alone with the notebook, I added a line the way I always do when something changes. Not names, not praise. A note to myself. Reputation is a slow river. You notice it only when it has carved the bank. My father had spent years believing rivers move only in directions he understands. He'd mistaken noise for force, lineage for leverage. At that table, the current shifted. Not because I pushed it, but because enough people finally felt it under their feet. I didn't need him to say the name they used when it mattered. I needed him to hear it said by others and realize he'd been listening to the wrong things. That kind of correction takes time, sometimes a lifetime. The ledger doesn't rush. It waits for patterns. It waits for rooms to catch up. And when they do, it doesn't announce itself. It simply keeps the ink honest. The room never quite went back to normal after Ethan spoke. It tried. Plates were passed. Someone asked who wanted dark meat. A laugh skittered and fell apart, but the air had shifted like a thermostat nudged by an unseen hand. People recalibrated without admitting they were doing it. That's how communities work when they're deciding what to believe next. My father reclaimed the floor the way he always had, by filling space. He told a story about the old mill, about how the town used to smell like work. He laughed at his own punchlines. Heads nodded out of habit, not agreement. I watched the patterns change. Who leaned in, who leaned back, who asked follow-ups that weren't really about the story at all. Promotion approvals, my aunt said, finally, careful as if stepping onto thin ice. That's quite a responsibility. It's a process, I said. I kept my tone neutral. A team effort. Ethan shook his head just enough to disagree without being rude. Ma'am? He caught himself, glanced at the table, recalibrated. I mean, she chairs the review. She doesn't just move paper. She asks the questions no one else wants to ask. My father smiled thinly. Every system needs a clerk, he said. Someone to keep it tidy. There it was. The line he'd been saving. A reduction that fit neatly into his worldview. I felt the old reflex rise, stay still, let it pass, but something else met it and held. The room had changed. The reduction didn't land the way it used to. Ethan didn't bristle. He didn't puff up. He spoke the way people do when they're choosing accuracy over comfort. Sir, he said, if she were a clerk, I'd still be waiting. Instead, I'm shipping out with bars that mean something because she didn't let me skip the hard parts. A fork clinked against a plate. Someone in the den muted the television without looking at the remote. My father opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Well, he said, palms up, a gesture meant to signal generosity. I'm glad you had help. Support, Ethan corrected gently, and accountability. I watched my father absorb that word the way he used to absorb unfamiliar terrain, measuring, adjusting, refusing to show the strain. He'd built his life on the idea that accountability flowed downward. Seeing it move sideways unsettled him. Conversation loosened around us, not away. Questions came cautious at first. What kind of review? How many people? What happens if someone disagrees? I answered what I could without turning the table into a briefing. I didn't list accomplishments. I described process. The work doesn't belong to one throat. It belongs to the room when the room decides to listen. A cousin I barely knew leaned over. I always thought promotions were automatic, she said. Time in, time up. I smiled. Time helps, I said, but readiness decides. My father tried humor again. So she decides who's ready now. He laughed, inviting the room to join him. No one did. Not because they were angry, because they were thinking. There's a difference and it shows. Thinking looks like lowered chins, eyes, focused hands still. Anger fidgets. This was thinking. The turkey went cold. People didn't notice. Someone refilled my water. Someone else asked Ethan about his unit. He answered, then turned back to me. For the record, he said quietly, so only a few could hear, you didn't just approve me. You told me no twice before you told me yes. That mattered. I nodded. You did the work. That's the point, he said, and left it there. My father stood then the way men do when they need to reassert gravity. I suppose we should be grateful, he said, lifting his glass. To service in all its forms. It was a safe toast. It should have worked. It would have once. But gratitude, when offered to avoid recognition, rings hollow. The clink was sparse. I didn't stand. I didn't counter toast. I let the moment settle. Silence can heal too when it's chosen. After dessert, pumpkin pie cut into careful slices, whipped cream melting too fast, people drifted. Small clusters formed and dissolved. I found myself answering questions that weren't questions at all. We're proud of you. My nephew wants to enlist. Do you think he's ready? I answered each with the same care I bring to work. Pride belongs to the giver. Readiness belongs to the candidate. My father hovered near the sink, hands clasped behind his back like a man inspecting a field he once owned. People gave him space not out of disrespect but recalibration. Respect, when it moves, needs room. I poured coffee I didn't want and leaned against the counter. Ethan approached, keeping distance. I didn't mean to make a scene, he said. You didn't, I said. You made it honest. He nodded, relief softening his shoulders. He didn't know. He didn't ask, I said. There was no accusation in it. Just fact. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the tablecloth folded, my father finally met my eyes without an audience. We'll talk, he said, the phrase he'd used years ago to postpone a reckoning. Yes, I said, tomorrow. That surprised him. He'd expected retreat or confrontation. He got neither. Boundaries are often mistaken for defiance by people used to control. As I left the room, I caught my reflection in the darkened window, older than the girl who'd left town on a bus, steadier than the woman who'd learned to wait. The table had spoken my name without me saying it. Not as a title, as a fact. Second servings are rarely about food. They're about whether the room is ready to take in what it missed the first time. That night the town took a bite and didn't choke. Morning comes differently after a night like that. The house was quiet in the way only older houses get, not asleep, just resting its joints. Pale light leaned through the kitchen window and laid itself across the counter where my mother used to line up mugs by size. The coffee maker gurgled, then sighed as if relieved to be useful again. I stood there longer than necessary, hands around a cup, letting heat do what words couldn't yet. My father came in without announcing himself. No blazer this time. Just a sweater that had lost its shape and slippers he'd never wear outside. He moved carefully like a man learning a new floor plan. For a moment we shared the room without speaking, two people who knew the cost of getting this wrong. He poured coffee and didn't fill it all the way. That told me more than anything he could have said. Control loosens first in small measurements. So he began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. You approve promotions. I nodded. I chair a review. I sign when the work holds. He took a sip, winced at the heat, set the mug down. You could have told me. There it was. The old refrain repackaged as curiosity. I waited a beat, not to punish, to let the room catch up. You never asked, I said. Then kinder, because kindness doesn't weaken truth. And I didn't think it would matter to you. He bristled at that just slightly. Of course it matters. I looked at the table, the nick in the wood where a pot had once burned the finish. He'd lectured me for an hour that day about carelessness. It matters now, I said. That's not the same thing. Silence arrived, the familiar one, but it behaved differently this time. It didn't press. It waited. He stared at the window as if it might offer instructions. Outside, a leaf skittered across the porch and caught in a crack. I didn't know, he said finally. 4 words, not an apology, not yet. A statement of fact. He was good at facts. I know, I said. That's what happens when you decide early. He frowned, considering. Decide what? Who someone is, I said. Before they finish becoming. He took that in the way he used to take in new regulations, skeptical, precise, unwilling to discard the old ones without proof. He stopped. Started again. I expected a son. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic. The thing that had sat between us like furniture no one acknowledged. I didn't rush to soften it. We were both too old for quick repairs. Names get heavy, I said. I picked up a different kind of weight. He nodded slowly. His eyes tracked the grain of the table. They call you... He trailed off, embarrassed by the romance of it. The ledger. I smiled small. It's just a handle, I said. What matters is what you lift with it. He huffed almost a laugh, then stopped himself. You always did like lists. I like accountability, I said. They're related. He sat finally, and the chair creaked in a way that sounded like permission. When he said it about the promotion, I thought he was being polite. I thought... He shook his head. I didn't understand the room. That happens, I said. Rooms change. He looked at me, then really looked as if checking alignment. Did you ever want me there? He asked. At any of it. I considered the question with the care it deserved. Only if you could stand, I said. Not for me, for yourself. He flinched, not at the words, but at the picture they painted. He had always stood when it was his turn. Standing when it wasn't was a different muscle. We drank our coffee. The clock ticked. 3 minutes passed. He broke the quiet with something practical. Your mother would have liked that you kept records, he said. I swallowed. She taught me to write in the margins, I said. To leave room. He nodded, eyes wet and not hiding it. She always did. I should tell you what she said, I added, at the end. He didn't interrupt. Keep flying, I said, not away, just up. He closed his eyes long enough to register the weight, then opened them with care. If I came, he said, gesturing vaguely, meaning any future room with chairs facing forward, would there be a seat? There's always a seat, I said. You choose where to put your hands. That landed. He looked at his hands wrapped around the mug and loosened them a fraction. It was small. It was everything. I stood to rinse my cup and set it upside down to dry. At the threshold, he cleared his throat. Proud, he said. 1 word. Naked. He didn't dress it up. He didn't follow it with conditions. I nodded. I didn't cry. I've learned that some truths don't need witnesses to be real. Outside, the air was cold and clean. I ran the perimeter road until my ribs found their rhythm. Movement has a way of forgiving what conversation can't yet reach. When I finished, my phone buzzed with a message from work, a question, a decision, a familiar pull. I answered it. The ledger stays open. Back inside, my father stood at the window watching nothing in particular. He looked smaller in daylight, not diminished, recalibrated. A man out of date maybe, but updating. That's all I needed. We didn't fix everything. We didn't have to. We set a boundary that could hold and named a respect that could breathe. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't a punishment. It was a pause. And pauses used properly let the next thing arrive on time. The base woke the way it always does, efficient, unromantic, honest about what it expects from you. I arrived before the sun finished, deciding whether it would show up the sky the color of unpolished steel. Boots on concrete, doors opening and closing with practiced indifference. The day didn't care what had happened at a Thanksgiving table 2 states away. That was a relief. Work has a way of setting things back into scale. My office smelled faintly of paper and coffee that had been reheated once too often. I set my bag down and took out the notebook, the black cover softened by use. The ledger. I don't open it ceremonially. I open it because the next decision is already waiting. Names don't get written for sentiment. They get written because time moves whether you're ready or not. There was a message from Ethan, short and careful. Shipping tomorrow. Thank you for holding the line. I wrote back just as carefully. You held it. Stay boring. Boring gets people home. He sent a thumbs up, then nothing. Good. The work doesn't require epilogues. The morning filled itself with the ordinary weight of responsibility. A review to schedule, a concern to flag, a disagreement to cool before it hardened into pride. I moved through it the way I always do, listening for what's said and what isn't, noting where the air thins. At midday, I added a line to the ledger, not about a person, but about a process that needed shoring up. Accountability ages well when you tend it. Over the next weeks, Thanksgiving became a story the town told without me. It changed in the telling as stories do, smoothing edges here, sharpening them there. I heard about it sideways through a friend of a friend, through a note left on my mother's old address that someone forwarded with a smiley face. Heard your dad learned something. People like morals. They like them, especially when they don't have to change much themselves. My father wrote once. Not an email, a card, typed address. Inside 4 sentences, each one careful, each one weighed. Coffee tastes different now. I'm trying to listen more than I speak. I stood at the service last Sunday, not the way I used to. Thank you for not correcting me in public. He signed his name the way he always had, but the space around it felt new. I didn't frame the card. I put it in the ledger pocket where I keep things that matter but don't need display. Respect isn't a trophy, it's a practice. You do it again tomorrow and the day after that, and you see who you become. Work continued. It always does. A promotion delayed for good reasons. Another approved because someone had finally learned how to hear feedback without flinching. A junior officer asked me how to handle a room that resented her before she spoke. I told her to show her math and share her credit. Knock twice, I said. On doors, on people. She wrote it down like a lifeline. Some afternoons when the light slants just right, I think about the house where rank came before love and how much of it I carried anyway. Discipline, care with details, the belief that systems can be made fair if you tend them without ego. My father gave me those things without intending to. He just didn't imagine I'd use them where he couldn't see. Understanding that has softened something in me that didn't need to stay sharp. We met once more before the winter set in. Neutral ground, a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the 90s. He ordered coffee, I ordered tea. We talked about weather then, about gutters, then about nothing that required defense. At the end, he asked one question and waited for the answer. That waiting told me more than any apology could have. I answered. It held. The ledger keeps moving. It will after me too. That's the point. Authority that lasts outlives the person who practices it. It becomes a habit others pick up because it works. I don't need my name attached to that. Names are lighter than work. What stays after the dishes are done isn't the clever line or the moment the room went quiet. It's the recalibration. The chairs moved an inch. The air learned a new density. A man practiced listening. A woman practiced not shrinking. A community edited itself toward accuracy. That's not spectacle, that's maintenance. Revenge, if you insist on calling it that, didn't look like triumph. It looked like stillness. Like choosing not to twist a knife when history hands it to you. Like standing straight long enough that other people remember their own spines and find them sufficient. I keep the ledger open because the work isn't finished. It never is. There's always another decision waiting to be made carefully, another room that needs its chairs arranged so people can sit without fear. I'll be there, pen ready, listening for what holds. If this story sat with you, if it reminded you of a table you've sat at, a name you've carried, or a moment when quiet competence finally found its witness, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, or share a moment when truth changed the room you were in. We have more stories like this to tell about service dignity and standing tall without shouting. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let's keep walking this road together, one careful decision at a time.